In the middle of a busy Saturday afternoon in the fall of 1965, two women stepped inside a fancy clothing shop on a famous street in the heart of the city. The older woman, May, was 62 years old, and she was accompanied by her 33-year-old daughter, Elise. This shop, known as Miller's Fine Goods, was famous for selling clothes to the richest people in the world. For a long time, the owners did not allow black people to shop there, and they had only started letting them in very recently. Both women looked very successful. May wore a dark blue outfit with expensive jewelry and a purse that was worth more than a few months of rent for a normal family. Elise wore a beautiful light yellow dress and white gloves, looking just as fancy as any other wealthy lady in the building. They walked around the store with a calm and proud attitude, looking at the high-quality silk and designer outfits. A young woman working at the store walked up to them and asked if they needed help. May told her they were looking for a special dress to wear to a big party. The worker seemed a bit uneasy about helping them, but she tried to be nice and started showing them the newest dresses for the season. For a little while, everything went smoothly. May and Elise looked at different fabrics and talked about the prices and styles in a very polite and smart way. It was clear they were used to buying nice things. Other people in the store looked at them with mean faces or stared because they were surprised to see them there. However, because new laws had recently been passed to protect people's rights, the other shoppers knew they couldn't openly mistreat them, even if they were unhappy about sharing the shop with them. Everything changed at 3:15 p.m. when a man named Arthur Sterling IV marched into the boutique. Arthur was 66 years old and incredibly wealthy. He had started with a massive inheritance from his family's railroad business and turned it into a $50 million fortune by buying up land all over the city. He owned dozens of skyscrapers, ran several local banks, and belonged to private clubs that went out of their way to keep black people out. In the business world, he was famous for being a bully who refused to rent homes to anyone he didn't like, especially minority families whom he considered beneath him. Arthur had come to the shop to get some custom suits. When he spotted May and Elise looking at pricey gowns while a white employee helped them, he became incredibly angry. His face turned bright purple, and he looked like he was about to explode. What happened next was so terrible that it stayed in the news for days. Even though new laws were supposed to stop this kind of hate, Arthur didn't care. He walked straight up to the two women and started screaming so loudly that everyone in the building stopped to listen. According to many people who were there, the things he said were disgusting. He used the worst possible names and shouted that black people didn't belong in a store meant for high society. He even yelled that the new laws were a mistake and were ruining the country. His insults were so mean and personal that even the other prejudiced shoppers in the room were embarrassed by his behavior. He even threatened to call the police and have them locked up for causing a scene. He shouted that they must have stolen their money, claiming that no black person could earn enough to shop at Miller's Fine Goods legally. His words were so cruel that both women began to cry. A witness named Sarah Jenkins, who was 52 at the time, later shared what she saw. She mentioned that while she had heard plenty of mean language growing up in the city, she had never seen anything this hateful in public, especially since the new laws for equal rights had just been signed. She described how Arthur Sterling acted like a total monster, calling the women names and saying their very presence was making the shop dirty. He kept yelling that the store should be allowed to kick out whoever they wanted and demanded they get out before he used force to remove them. Through all of this, May and Elise stayed quiet. They didn't yell back or fight, they just stood there with their heads held high, even though they were being treated terribly in front of everyone. But Arthur wasn't done yet. He grabbed the expensive silk dress that Elise had been looking at, one that cost $700, and threw it onto the dusty floor. He screamed that the dress was ruined because a black person had touched it. He even offered to pay for the dress himself as long as the store promised to burn it instead of selling it to anyone else. Finally, he demanded to see the manager. He told the manager that he would never shop there again unless the store went back to its old ways of keeping certain people out. A shop worker named David Wu said the whole thing lasted about 5 minutes, but it felt like forever. He told reporters that Arthur Sterling was acting like a madman, screaming awful things while the two women just stood there and took it. He noticed that the older woman looked like she wanted to say something, but she bit her tongue to keep from making things worse. Her daughter was sobbing, completely heartbroken by the mean words. Even though the other shoppers looked uneasy, not a single person stepped in to help or tell Arthur to be quiet. Everyone just stood still while a rich bully attacked their feelings in the middle of the shop. Finally, after several minutes of being yelled at, May took Elise's hand. They didn't run away, they walked to the exit with their heads up, even though they were both crying. Arthur didn't stop there. He followed them all the way to the front door, shouting mean names until they reached the sidewalk. Witnesses remember him screaming one last thing as they walked down the street. He yelled that the new laws wouldn't change anything and that fancy stores would never be for people like them, no matter what the government said. He stood in the doorway, still shouting at their backs. It was a terrible thing to see, especially when the world was supposed to be changing for the better. But there was something Arthur Sterling, and everyone else in the store, didn't realize yet. He had just made a massive mistake. These weren't just two random women he could pick on without any consequences. They were the family of Bumpy Johnson, the toughest and most feared man in all of Harlem. Bumpy had been out of prison for less than a year, and in those few months, he had already taken back control of his business and made himself one of the most powerful people in the city. Arthur Sterling was about to learn a lesson in respect that would destroy everything he owned. By 4:30 p.m. that same day, May and Elise arrived at Bumpy's headquarters above a popular restaurant on a main street in Harlem. They were still trembling from the attack. A man named Slim Harrison, who was Bumpy's right-hand man, saw them walk in. He later said that May tried to act like nothing was wrong because she didn't want Bumpy to get into trouble so soon after coming home from prison. But Bumpy wasn't fooled. He saw his daughter's tear-stained face and knew something had gone terribly wrong. He demanded to know what happened. May tried to brush it off as just another rude person at a shop, the kind of thing they faced way too often. But Bumpy wouldn't let it go. Finally, Elise told him the whole truth. She told him about the rich man at the boutique who had screamed those horrible names at them. She described how he threw the expensive dress on the floor and said they were dirty. She told her father how a room full of people watched them get bullied and did nothing to help. Bumpy didn't say a word while his daughter spoke. His face stayed very still, but those who knew him noticed his eyes get narrow and sharp. It was a look that meant he was filled with a quiet, dangerous anger. Once Elise finished explaining what the man had done, Bumpy Johnson asked just one thing. Does anyone know who he is? May told him they didn't get his full name, but she remembered the shop manager calling him Mr. Sterling while trying to quiet him down. She also mentioned the man bragged about owning huge buildings across the city and was there to pick up expensive, custom-made suits. This told Bumpy that the man was a regular at the shop and very, very rich. Bumpy nodded slowly and told them, "Go home and relax. Look after Elise. Don't think about this anymore. I'm going to take care of it." Slim Harrison, who was watching, said the way Bumpy spoke sent a chill down his spine. His voice was icy and calm, which was always a sign that someone was in serious trouble. Usually, Bumpy was a kind and loving family man, but the moment someone touched his wife or daughter, he turned into a cold, focused predator. As soon as his family left, Bumpy got to work. He spent the next hour on the phone with his lawyer, Leo Vance, and several other people who knew everything about the city's business world. By 6 p.m., Bumpy knew exactly who Arthur Sterling IV was. He knew about his $50 million fortune, his history of being a bigot, and every single building he owned. Most importantly, he found out where Arthur was weak. Bumpy's lawyer later said that Bumpy made about 20 calls that night. He wasn't just angry, he was like a general planning a war. He found out who Arthur owed money to, who his business partners were, and what big deals he was trying to finish. Bumpy was looking for a way to ruin the man completely without anyone ever knowing who was behind the curtain. What Bumpy found was that even though Arthur seemed untouchable, his bank account was actually quite shaky. Arthur had borrowed a huge amount of money to pay for his tall buildings and relied on loans from banks to keep his business running. If that money stopped flowing, his empire would crumble. By Sunday morning, October 11, 1965, Bumpy had a full plan ready to wipe out Arthur Sterling's business, his friendships, and his name. The plan would take only 3 days. Bumpy was going to use his tough guys, his legal business partners, and his friends in politics to strike back. He knew that in this new world, being an open bigot could cost a man everything if the right people decided to act. His lawyer Leo explained that Bumpy's real talent wasn't just being scary, it was knowing exactly how to hit a person where it hurt the most. Arthur had used his status to shame Bumpy's family, so Bumpy was going to use his own status to crush Arthur. He wanted to show every wealthy bully in the city that the new laws were real and that hurting his family came with a price that would leave them with nothing. Starting Sunday, Bumpy reached out to his contacts, telling them what had happened and asking for help with a private matter. Over the next 3 days, Bumpy spent about $80,000. He didn't spend it on anything illegal. He spent it on smart business moves and legal deals designed to trap Arthur. Bumpy had strong ties with 3 banks that operated in his neighborhood. It turned out these same banks had given Arthur very large loans for his construction projects. Using middlemen to keep his own name hidden, Bumpy made sure these banks received some very troubling information about Arthur's finances. This information was entirely true, but it was put together in a way that made Arthur Sterling's money situation look much worse than it really was. Bumpy had his team create reports on everything Arthur owned. These papers didn't lie, but they focused heavily on the risks Arthur was taking. They showed how much debt he had, pointed out that his building projects were late and over budget, and highlighted his hateful behavior at the boutique. The report suggested that any bank working with Arthur could face bad press or legal trouble for supporting a known bigot. By Sunday afternoon, these reports were in the hands of the people in charge of the loans at 3 different banks. By Monday morning, all 3 banks started double-checking Arthur's accounts. They weren't forced to do it, they were just scared that Arthur was a risky person to be in business with now that his racism was public knowledge. Bumpy also used his connections with equal rights groups. Even though he was a criminal, he had donated a lot of money to these organizations because he believed in their cause and it helped his reputation. He reached out to leaders from groups like the NAACP and local community organizers. A local minister named Reverend Thomas Miller explained that Bumpy told these leaders exactly what Arthur had done. He gave them proof of Arthur's history of refusing to rent to black families and his cruel outburst at the shop. Bumpy even offered to pay for the costs of organizing legal protests and boycotts against Arthur's businesses. He was turning the community's anger into a legal and social weapon to tear Arthur down. The leaders of the rights groups weren't sure about taking money from someone like Bumpy at first. However, Bumpy made it clear he didn't want to run the show or get any credit. He simply wanted to fund a fair fight against a bully who had it coming. Once they understood his goal, they took the support and started organizing marches and pickets. At the same time, Bumpy went after Arthur's business partners. These were wealthy men who had put their own money into Arthur's building projects. Through his secret network, Bumpy made sure these investors heard that Arthur was about to become a magnet for trouble. They were told that protests were coming and that their own names might get dragged through the mud if they stayed connected to him. His lawyer Leo said these weren't empty threats. They were honest warnings about what was actually happening. The investors started calling Arthur, demanding to know how he planned to fix the mess he'd made. Arthur spent all of Sunday and Monday trying to calm them down instead of running his company. He was already in a panic before the first protester even showed up. Finally, Bumpy used his media connections. He knew people at the big city newspapers and the local neighborhood gazettes. He made sure the story of what happened at the boutique was everywhere. By Sunday, the local papers were already printing the news, and by Monday morning, the bigger city papers were reporting on Arthur's long history of being a bigot. One headline even screamed, "City Builder Attacks Women with Hateful Words." The local Harlem papers featured a front-page story with the headline, "Wealthy Developer Attacks Black Shoppers and Destroys Boutique Clothing." Even the big city newspapers joined in by Monday morning, printing articles about the accusations of bigotry at the famous Fifth Avenue shop. Bumpy made sure his wife and daughter's names weren't used to protect their privacy, but the details were so clear that everyone who saw the fight knew exactly who the bully was. On Monday morning, things got even worse for Arthur Sterling. At 9 a.m., about 50 protesters gathered in front of Arthur's biggest apartment building. They carried signs calling him a racist landlord and demanding justice. They handed out papers to everyone walking by, telling the story of how Arthur had treated May and Elise at the shop, and listing all the times he had refused to rent to black families in the past. By lunchtime, similar protests were happening at 2 more of Arthur's buildings. These demonstrations were peaceful and followed the law, but they caught the eyes of the news cameras. Reverend Miller noted that the protesters didn't have to break any rules to be effective. Just by standing on the sidewalk with their signs, they made Arthur's buildings look like places where nobody would want to live. This made Arthur's business partners even more terrified of being linked to him. To add more pressure, Bumpy paid for experts to help the people already living in Arthur's buildings. Many of these renters had been dealing with broken pipes, high rent, and unfair treatment for a long time because they had nowhere else to go. Now, they were finally getting the help they needed to stand up to their landlord. By Monday night on October 12th, about 200 people living in 9 of Arthur's buildings gathered at a local church. They formed a group to fight back together. They promised to stop paying rent, file reports with the city, and take Arthur to court unless he fixed their apartments and stopped his unfair treatment. Bumpy paid for everything behind the scenes. He funded the flyers, hired a lawyer to teach the renters about their rights under the new laws, and paid the fee to use the church. Reverend Miller said Bumpy didn't care about getting a thank you. He just wanted Arthur to pay for his cruelty, not just for what he did to Bumpy's family, but for years of picking on people who couldn't defend themselves. At the same time, Bumpy hit Arthur's social life. Arthur belonged to 2 very fancy private clubs that had always kept black people out. These clubs were already nervous because the new laws were putting pressure on them to change their ways. Through his secret contacts, Bumpy sent these clubs folders full of news clippings and photos of the protests outside Arthur's buildings. Bumpy's lawyer, Leo, explained that the timing was perfect. The clubs were terrified of being sued or shamed in the news. They didn't want the world to look too closely at their own rules. By Monday evening, one of the clubs told Arthur he had to quit. They told him they didn't want his personal problems making the club look bad. Arthur was being kicked out of the very high society he thought he owned. The second private club decided to put Arthur's membership on hold while they looked into the reports. By Tuesday morning, October 13th, the weight of everything Bumpy had set in motion was crushing Arthur's business. The financial collapse. The banks struck the hardest. 2 of the 3 banks that had been reviewing Arthur's accounts decided they wanted their money back immediately. They used special rules in their contracts that allowed them to demand full payment if a borrower's reputation became a risk. Together, they demanded $9 million right away. Arthur was rich on paper, but he didn't have that much cash sitting in a vault. To pay the banks, he would be forced to sell his buildings fast and for much less than they were worth. Trying to find a new loan was impossible because his name was now tied to the ugly headlines. Business partners walk away. By Tuesday afternoon, 4 of Arthur's biggest business partners quit. They told him they were leaving their joint building projects because they didn't want their own names connected to his racism. This was a disaster for Arthur. He now had to find the money to buy out their shares of the projects, which drained even more of his shrinking cash. Finding new partners was out of the question while protesters were still circling his offices. The rent strike. On Tuesday evening, the tenant group took their biggest step yet. Families in 4 of Arthur's buildings officially stopped paying him. Instead of handing over their checks, about 150 families put their money into a protected bank account. They told Arthur he wouldn't see a dime of the $65,000 in monthly rent until the buildings were fixed and the discrimination stopped. Usually, a landlord like Arthur could just kick people out, but now the tenants had expensive lawyers, paid for by Bumpy, and news reporters watching every move. Arthur was forced to hire a team of his own lawyers just to fight for the rent money he was losing every day. The high society freeze. By Tuesday, Arthur Sterling's social life was vanishing. Families who had spent years eating dinner with him and inviting him to parties began to cross his name off their lists. In the fancy circles of Manhattan, being a loud and messy bigot was suddenly a major social mistake. Sarah Jenkins, the witness from the shop, explained that the news had traveled fast. Some of their friends were truly disgusted by what he had done, while others were just embarrassed by how loud and public he had been. Screaming in a boutique and throwing clothes on the floor was seen as low class. In 1965, The world was moving on, and Arthur's behavior belonged in the past. By Tuesday night, his oldest friends were suddenly too busy to take his calls. Wednesday, October 14, 1965, a world in ruin. By Wednesday morning, Arthur's life was a complete disaster. He was facing a massive list of problems that seemed to happen all at once. The banks, they were still demanding their $9 million immediately. The partners, his investors, were running away from his projects. The rent, hundreds of tenants were refusing to pay him. The streets, protesters were outside his buildings every single day. The clubs, he was kicked out of one club and banned from another. Arthur was terrified and confused. He didn't understand why everything was falling apart at the exact same time. He spent the morning making desperate phone calls, trying to figure out who was behind this. Why were the banks suddenly calling him? Why were the rights groups picking on him when other landlords were just as mean? Every person he talked to gave him the same answer. It was because of what he did at Miller's Fine Goods on Saturday. He had become the face of racism in the city, and nobody wanted to be near him. He was poison, and anyone who stood by him would get burned too. None of the people he spoke to ever brought up Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy had stayed deep in the shadows, making sure every move against Arthur was lawful and handled by people who couldn't be traced back to him. Arthur had no clue that his world was being torn down by a specific person, especially not by the family of the women he had bullied just 4 days ago. That changed on Wednesday afternoon. A man named Leo Vance walked into Arthur's office in the middle of the city. He introduced himself as a lawyer for business groups in Harlem. Leo later told reporters that Arthur looked like a wreck. He hadn't shaved, his clothes were messy, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He was buried under piles of bank papers and was frantically calling everyone he knew to find money. When Leo walked in, Arthur didn't even look up. He just snapped, "I don't care what you want. I'm busy with a dozen problems right now." Leo calmly replied, "I know you are. In fact, I'm here to tell you exactly why all these problems started at the same time." Leo then sat down and told Arthur the truth. His business and his social life weren't failing by accident. It was a planned strike back for what he had done to May and Elise at the shop on Saturday. "Last weekend," Leo told him, "you shamed 2 women in public. You yelled hateful things for everyone to hear, threw expensive clothes on the ground, and claimed the law didn't apply to you. Those women belong to Bumpy Johnson. He has a lot of influence in this city, from the banks to the streets. Mr. Johnson was very upset with how you spoke to his wife and daughter. Everything that has happened to you since then, the lost loans, the partners leaving, the protesters, the news stories, and your friends turning their backs, that was all Mr. Johnson. He wanted to teach you a lesson about respect. He wanted you to know that the new laws are very real." Leo continued, "There are heavy prices to pay for treating people the way you treated Mr. Johnson's family." According to Leo, Arthur's face turned pale as the realization hit him. He stuttered, "That can't be true. Bumpy Johnson is just a thug who was just in jail. There is no way he can control banks, fancy clubs, or the news." Leo shook his head. "Mr. Johnson has friends in this city you couldn't even imagine. His reach goes into every neighborhood and every community, black, white, and everyone else. He isn't just a man from the streets. He funds the groups fighting for justice, knows the people who write the laws, and has the ear of the city's leaders. When you attacked his family, he used every single one of those tools to make you regret it. Welcome to the new world, Arthur. The laws have changed, and men like Bumpy Johnson are here to make sure you feel that change in your wallet." Desperate and shaking, Arthur asked what he could do to make it stop. He wanted to know how to get Bumpy to pull back the dogs that were tearing his life apart. Leo's answer was cold and final. "Nothing. You can't stop it. The banks already want their money. Your partners are gone. Your buildings are empty of rent, and the protesters aren't leaving. Your reputation is in the trash. Mr. Johnson doesn't want your money or your sorry. He already did what he wanted to do. He showed you that the days of treating black people like garbage without any consequences are over." Leo stood up to walk out, but he stopped at the door to give Arthur one last message from Bumpy. "One more thing, Arthur. Mr. Johnson wants you to know that his wife and daughter are going back to that same shop next Saturday to finish their shopping." "They are going back to that store," Leo said firmly. "And if anyone, you, the managers, or even another shopper, shows them anything but the highest level of respect, the nightmare you lived through this week will seem like a pleasant dream compared to what comes next. Is that clear?" Arthur just gave a weak nod, looking completely broken by the news. 1 week after the original confrontation, on Saturday, October 17, 1965, May and Elise returned to Miller's Fine Goods at 2:45 p.m. This time, they weren't alone. Leo Vance and Slim Harrison stood near the front doors to keep watch. Outside, about 30 members of various civil rights groups stood on the sidewalk to make sure everything went smoothly. The atmosphere in the shop was completely different. The manager met May and Elise right at the entrance, offering a sincere apology for the previous Saturday. He told them that Arthur Sterling had been banned from the store for life. He promised that the shop would now strictly follow the new laws and that every person, regardless of their background, would be treated with kindness. For an hour and a half, 3 different employees helped the 2 women. They brought out the most expensive gowns and gave them the kind of high-end service usually only seen by the city's most famous families. Even the other shoppers changed their tune. Several people who had stood by silently during Arthur's outburst the week before went out of their way to be nice. They made small talk and told May and Elise how wonderful they looked. It was clear to everyone that the rules had changed. Sarah Jenkins, who was there to witness the return visit, said the change was unbelievable. "The week before, these women were treated horribly while we all stood by and watched in shame," she remarked. "This time, they were treated like queens." The shop's supervisor was incredibly helpful and regretful. The employees were perfect professionals, and those of us who had seen the attack the week before did our best to show that we were sorry for what had happened and that we wanted things to change. I even walked up to the older woman, I found out her name was May Johnson, and told her how bad I felt for not speaking up when she was being bullied. She was very kind about it. She told me she hoped this situation would make things better for all black families who had been treated poorly in fancy shops for so long. May and Elise bought about $2,000 worth of outfits and jewelry that day, including the beautiful party dresses they had first come to find. The manager himself wrapped their boxes and walked them to the exit, asking them to please come back whenever they liked. As they stepped onto the sidewalk with their shopping bags, the people from the NAACP and other groups started to clap. It was a moment of victory, showing that black women could shop anywhere they wanted without being afraid. It proved that the new laws were more than just words on a page. They were being backed up by the power of the community. Slim Harrison and Leo Vance walked beside the women as they headed toward their car for the ride back to Harlem. Leo smiled and asked how the day went. "It was much better than last time," May answered, according to what Slim later told reporters. "Please let Bumpy know that we are very grateful for his help. I think the whole city has figured out by now what happens to anyone who dares to insult his family." "I will tell him," Leo said. "But I think every bigoted businessman in the city already got the message loud and clear." Arthur Sterling IV never got his life back. The 3-day destruction of his fortune and his reputation was total. He had learned the hardest way possible that the world had changed, and Bumpy Johnson was the one who had changed it for him. By the end of 1965, Arthur had been forced to sell off 14 of his 19 skyscrapers at a massive loss just to pay back the banks and his former partners. In only 4 months, his fortune plummeted from $50 million to around $12 million. He lost nearly $38 million in a heartbeat. The social cold shoulder never ended. He was officially kicked out of his clubs, and the city's high society continued to treat him like he didn't exist. His wife even left him in early 1966, moving far away to their country house and refusing to come back to the city. She told friends she was too embarrassed to show her face after her husband had become the most famous bigot in New York. Arthur tried to fix his business over the next couple of years, but his name was poisoned. Banks wouldn't talk to him, investors ran the other way, and renters stayed far away from any building he owned. He passed away from a broken heart and a stroke in the spring of 1969 at the age of 70. He died alone, totally ignored by the wealthy circles that used to treat him like a king. What Bumpy Johnson did to that man became a legend, Reverend Miller said. To the tough guys on the street, it was proof that Bumpy's power had no limits. He could ruin the richest man in Manhattan if he wanted to. To the people fighting for justice, it was a perfect lesson in how to use money and teamwork to crush a bully. Arthur Sterling learned far too late that the world had moved on. He found out the hard way that when someone like Bumpy Johnson decides to fight for his family, the new laws aren't just words, they are a weapon that can destroy everything you own. The message was clear: treating people with hatred could cost you everything you spent a lifetime creating. The total downfall of Arthur Sterling, mixed with the community groups Bumpy funded and the massive news coverage, sent shockwaves through the city's shopping and housing markets for years. Many fancy shops that had been slow to follow the new laws, shops that used to be mean to black customers to make them feel unwelcome, suddenly changed their tune. They began inviting black shoppers in and teaching their workers how to be helpful and fair. Miller's Fine Goods, the very shop where it all started, became a leader in this change. They hired their first black employee in the winter of 1965 and started putting ads in local papers promising equal treatment for everyone. Other stores on the famous avenue followed along during the next year. They were partly afraid of being the next ones to lose their business, and partly because they realized that keeping out people with money was just bad business. Bumpy wasn't trying to change the world's shopping habits, Leo Vance explained. He just wanted to punish the man who made his family cry. But by wiping Arthur Sterling off the map so publicly, he showed the city that being a bigot was a very expensive mistake. Integration happened faster because Bumpy proved that the new laws had teeth. Businessmen across Manhattan realized that racism wasn't just wrong, it was a financial risk they couldn't afford, especially when they might accidentally offend someone with the power to fight back. In the end, Charles Petton's greatest mistake wasn't just his bigotry, it was his belief that his status made him untouchable. He walked into that Fifth Avenue boutique on October 10, 1964, believing he was a king, and left a week later as a ghost, haunted by a $34 million loss, a shattered reputation, and a family that had abandoned him. He learned too late that the calendar had turned. October 1964 was a new world, a place where the Civil Rights Act had shifted the ground beneath his feet. And while the law provided the framework, it was Bumpy Johnson who provided the enforcement. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal, a man who lived by his own rules, but in this moment, he became an unlikely architect of social change. He didn't use a gun to solve the problem, he used strategic economic warfare. He proved that real power in the post-civil rights era wasn't about who you could bully. It was about making the cost of racism so high that no one could afford to pay it. As May and Ruthie drove away from Fifth Avenue on that final Saturday, their bags filled with expensive silks and their dignity fully restored, the doors of New York's high-end retail didn't just open for them, they stayed open for everyone who would follow. Charles Petton lost everything he had built in a lifetime, all because he failed to realize one simple truth. The rules had changed, and Bumpy Johnson was the one holding the whistle. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Bumpy Johnson's legendary retaliation, don't let the story end here. Drop a comment below. Did Bumpy go too far, or was this the perfect lesson in respect? And if you want more stories about the hidden power players of history, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload.